She only glimpsed it for 3 seconds, a woman in green, gloved hands raised in silent terror, strangled before her eyes as two trains passed. No body, no name, no report. But MissMarple knew, when truth flashes past that fast, it rarely disappears without leaving blood on the tracks. In the quietude of a St. Mary morning, as the sun filtered gently through lace curtains and the tea cooled ever so slightly in its cup, MissMarple sat with her knitting needles resting in her lap. The arrival of the post, so often consisting of circulars or small notes from the vicarage, brought on this occasion an envelope of a different nature, firmer in paper, unfamiliar in hand, and bearing the distinctly upright script of a former school mistress. It was from Miss Wilhelmina Clee, once of Hartfield House, now retired to a boarding establishment in Ealing. MissMarple's eyes narrowed slightly in recognition. Wilhelmina had always been a serious-minded woman, scrupulous to a fault, with a memory trained to precision, and a manner that brooked no nonsense, that she would write it all, and in such a tone, urgent, personal, and above all uncharacteristically unsure, was enough to command attention. The letter, though tidy in form, bore the weight of an unsettled conscience. Miss Clee claimed she had witnessed a murder, no less, from the window of a railway carriage. A woman, she wrote, had been violently strangled before her very eyes, as their trains passed in opposite directions. It had been the 11:45 from Paddington Green, and the sight, however brief, had left her shaken. MissMarple folded the letter slowly, the rhythm of her breathing unbroken. Then she picked up her knitting once more, murmuring, "People so rarely imagine violence with such clarity, unless, of course, they've truly seen it." The train had surged past in a sudden rush of steam and speed, but Miss Clee, seated by the window with her embroidery resting on her knees, had caught a glimpse that would not leave her. A compartment, second-ass with an open door, had shown two figures in sharp silhouette, a woman with gloved hands raised in terror, and another, taller, broader, leaning in with unmistakable force. The moment had lasted no more than 3 seconds, yet the impression had etched itself with the clarity of a memory long rooted. She had written it down at once, as was her nature, noting the carriage number and the approximate milepost. When she arrived at her destination, she reported it calmly but firmly to the railway authorities. There had been skepticism, of course. A lady of her years, they implied, might have mistaken shadows for substance, but Miss Clee had not mistaken it. She had seen panic in the woman's eyes, and the color of her scarf, green silk, stood out against the dull upholstery. MissMarple considered this detail with interest. A woman in green, panic, pressure, no body, only a moment. But moments in MissMarple's experience were often where truth chose to hide. At Paddington, the train had arrived without delay, and certainly without incident. There had been no alarm raised, no missing passengers, and no reports of disturbance. The railway staff had conducted what they termed a light inspection of the carriages, which amounted, Miss Clee noted tartly, to no more than a cursory glance through the windows and a peremptory check of the corridor. The compartment she had identified had already been swept clean by the time anyone thought to search it. There were no signs of a struggle, nor was there a woman in green among the passengers who disembarked. No handbag left behind, no torn fabric, no cries for help, merely a clean compartment and a woman's certainty. The police, when they became involved, though they did so with an air of indulgence rather than concern, had suggested it might have been a lover's quarrel or a poorly lit reflection mistaken for violence. When Miss Clee insisted otherwise, they recommended rest. And so, like so many uncomfortable things, the matter was laid aside. But not for MissMarple, for she had long known that when a thing is dismissed too swiftly, it is often because someone wishes it to vanish completely. What struck MissMarple most, as she traced her finger lightly over the route the 11:45 must have taken, was a certain curve of track, almost forgotten on modern maps, that passed within sight of the old Fortescue estate. There had once been a private siding there, used long ago when the Fortescues were at the height of their social splendor, and considered travel by shared compartment unthinkable. MissMarple remembered the family well enough. She had met Lady Fortescue once at a garden fair in 1911. Imperious and proud, Lady Fortescue had had little patience for the inconsequential chatter of women like Miss Marple, but gossip flowed freely in village circles nonetheless, and the Fortescues were never without their share of it. Edward the son had married late and somewhat beneath expectation, it was said, while Lord Fortescue himself had retreated from public life, with rumors of poor investments and private shame swirling about him. Still, the estate stood, reduced certainly, but intact. Miss Marple gazed again at Miss Clee's letter. The siding had not been used in years, but a woman in green had vanished from a train as it passed that very bend. That was not coincidence. That was direction. Miss Marple, though never one to impose, could nonetheless present herself in such a way that to deny her would seem unkind. And so it was that a letter delicately phrased and filled with pleasantries about rose bushes and memories of long-ago luncheons brought her an invitation to Fortescue Hall. It was not a warm invitation, nor an eager one, but it was acceptable. Lady Fortescue, after all, remained a woman of tradition. The hall, when Miss Marple arrived, bore all the marks of Gentile decline. The gravel drive was no longer rad. The shutters needed paint, and the air inside held the faint bitterness of dust, disturbed only occasionally. Lady Fortescue sat in a winged chair by the fireplace, proud still, but with a tortoise around the mouth that spoke of constant management, of appearances, of memory, of propriety. Edward, introduced perfunctorily, was distant, his handshake cold. His wife Vivian offered tea, and an apologetic smile that trembled slightly at the corners. Miss Marple made no mention of trains or women in green. She spoke instead of rose gardens and the difficulty of finding reliable help, but her eyes beneath half-lowered lids observed everything. The room was full of silence, but not of peace. And in one corner, a faded photograph had been turned face down. It was during a quiet walk in the overgrown garden that Miss Marple found the opportunity for conversation, not meant to be overheard. A young maid new to service, but wise enough to know when kindness had no motive, lingered near the lavender border, pulling weeds that did not trouble her in the least. Miss Marple, pausing with deliberate ease, remarked on the loneliness of large houses and the things one did not speak of in drawing rooms. The maid, glancing about as though the rhododendrons might hear her, spoke in a hushed voice. There was a girl, she said years ago. She worked here. Then she didn't. Miss Marple did not press. She let the silence fill the space, and the maid continued. They say she went away, but no one ever saw her leave, and no one ever said her name again. A robin chirped nearby, indifferent. Miss Marple looked toward the ancient hedges and the old stone sundial at the edge of the garden path. The maid went back to her task, her lips now firmly closed. Miss Marple walked on, her steps light, but her mind turning slowly, like the hands of a long-wound clock, drawing ever nearer to an hour no one wished to remember. Fortescue Hall presented itself with the weary dignity of a house that had once mattered. Miss Marple's arrival, unhurried and without ostentation, was received with the kind of grace one extends to an uninvited memory. The gravel crunched beneath carriage wheels that had carried better visitors in better days, and the front steps bore the dull sheen of stone, long untouched by a proper polish. The footman, too young for such a post and poorly trained, opened the door without flourish. It was Graves, the butler, who carried the weight of the household's dignity. Now, though his gait had grown heavier, and the polish of his shoes no longer gleamed with conviction, inside the air was thick with the slow accumulation of quietness. No clocks chimed, no pianoforte sounded. The parlor to which Miss Marple was shown was draped in damask and silence. Yet Miss Marple's eyes, unassumingly sharp, missed nothing. The rug once aubusson had faded into dull pastels. A crack above the mantel had been concealed by a dusty oil painting. Its subject, a hound beside a broken bird cage, disturbingly apartment. She did not comment on the decline. That would have been impolite, but she felt it, as one feels the slow rot behind a fine veneer. And though Lady Fortescue was not yet present, Miss Marple already sensed the shape of a household in retreat from society, from questions, perhaps even from memory itself. Lady Fortescue entered the room with the poise of one who believed manners to be a substitute for warmth. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod that suggested neither surprise nor delight, merely endurance. Her voice, when she spoke, retained the clipped tones of an earlier generation, though age had carved deep parentheses around her mouth. She sat with the posture of command, but the hands that folded in her lap trembled faintly. Lord Fortescue made no appearance, and when Miss Marple inquired after his health, she was informed too quickly that he took most of his rest in the study, as befitted a man of serious disposition. The words were not unkind, but they carried finality. He would not be disturbed. Edward Fortescue appeared next. He was tall, with a complexion too pale for his years, and a restlessness about the jaw that betrayed habitual clenching. His greeting was civil, but remote. He made no inquiry after Miss Marple's journey, nor did he remain long. Something about the room seemed to unsettle him, or perhaps someone. Vivian, his wife, arrived a few minutes later. Her beauty was of a delicate, almost translucent kind, like pressed flowers left between pages. She smiled too soon and too wide, and her gaze shifted with the unease of someone waiting for something to fall. Miss Marple observed, pleasantly silent. It was not the words spoken that mattered here, but the spaces between them. The Fortescues were a family folding in upon itself, and there was something underneath they did not wish disturbed. It was over tea, served in porcelain, that bore the faint spider webbing of age, that Miss Marple let the conversation drift, like a boat released from its moorings. She spoke gently of railways, of the changes in schedules, and of how the new express line had sadly rendered certain branch tracks all but obsolete. She mused aloud casually, as though from idle curiosity, that the train passing near the Fortescue estate had once enjoyed a private siding, had it not? Lady Fortescue, who had until that moment maintained the expression of a woman weathering polite company, paused. Her spoon clinked once against her saucer. Then, in a tone both brisk and brittle, she replied that the siding had not been in use for decades. Such conveniences had become unnecessary, and the coach that once stood there had long since been removed or dismantled. Miss Marple inclined her head as though the matter bore no particular significance. Yet she noted how Vivian's eyes had lowered at the word coach, and how Edward, though silent, shifted ever so slightly in his seat. It was the kind of reaction that one does not intend to give. The body betrays what the tongue will not. Later, while Miss Marple waited for her coat to be retrieved, she found herself once more in the company of Graves. The butler, always proper, stood at a modest distance. Miss Marple, feigning the need to steady herself against the small table near the vestibule, remarked how grand the estate must have been in its day. How charming to have a private train coach at one's disposal. Graves inclined his head respectfully, but there was the faintest hesitation, an imperceptible lag before speech, as though a drawer long closed had been cracked open within. He replied that the coach had been sold off many years ago. He believed, though his voice did not carry the confidence of memory, but the caution of invention. Miss Marple noted how his hands, resting at his sides, clenched just once, then returned to stillness. She asked in a tone of soft interest whether the coach had been well used. Graves bowed slightly. By the previous generation, madam, it is not a matter much spoken of now. Not cannot, Miss Marple reflected, but not spoken of. There was history buried in the silence, and Graves knew it. But butlers, proper ones, do not dig, nor do they divulge. They guard. The following day brought Miss Marple to the rectory, where the vicar's wife poured tea with the vague embarrassment of one who preferred her china unchipped. She had known the Fortescues since before the war, both wars, in fact, and though she professed little interest in scandal, she held the knowledge of past misfortunes with the same care she gave to heirloom lace. Over seed cake and small sips, Miss Marple inquired delicately, of course, about the Fortescue children. She expressed surprise that Edward had not had siblings. The vicar's wife demurred, then paused and remarked that there had once been another, though whether she had been a niece, a ward, or something in between was not entirely clear. She was young, the vicar's wife said after a moment. Very pretty, fond of poetry, and riding out alone. It was all quite dramatic. Miss Marple let the silence linger, and eventually, as such silences do, it filled itself. She disappeared, said the vicer's wife at last. There were stories, of course. She'd fallen in love with someone inappropriate, or she had gone abroad in disgrace. Some said she had a child, and then in a quieter tone she added, Lady Fortescue insisted she had gone willingly, but none of us ever saw her again. Miss Marple nodded, eyes lowered. In her experience, disappearances seldom occurred without arrangement, and arrangements, particularly those made by old families, had a way of cloaking disgrace in distance. On her way out, a brief misdirection down the corridor led Miss Marple past a wall hung with framed photographs, some proud, others faded by time and disinterest. It was there, among a series of family portraits in silver mounts, that her eye caught a peculiar absence. One frame, smaller than the rest, displayed a photograph, clearly torn. A young woman stood at the edge of a garden, her sun hat in one hand and a book in the other. But someone else had stood beside her once. The right-hand portion of the photograph had been cleanly removed, leaving behind only a sliver of arm and the suggestion of another figure. Miss Marple did not linger. She regarded the image as one might regard a painting, silent, composed, and curated to conceal. Later, as she sat knitting in her own parlor, her thoughts returned to the photograph and to the empty space where a face had once been, that she knew was the kind of removal that spoke not of error, but of intention. People vanish, yes, but so do memories, often with assistance. And when the effort to erase becomes that deliberate, one must ask not merely who, but why, and above all what still remains that threatens the peace of those who tried so hard to forget. It was in the wake of a Sunday service, when the village breathed a little more easily and conversation turned to rhubarb and roof slates, that Miss Marple heard of the child who had seen something she should not have. The girl in question was the milkman's niece, a quiet creature given to wandering between hedge and nettles, while the older folk discussed weather and window panes. Her aunt, with no sense of drama but an instinct for detail, mentioned it in passing. A few days before Miss Marple's arrival, the child had paused near the disused track that skirted the Fortescue estate. There, just beyond the overgrown platform, stood a woman in green, not moving, not waving, simply there, as though waiting for something or someone. She had been beautiful, the child said, pale as candle wax. She wore gloves. She did not speak. Miss Marple did not press. She merely asked with her usual delicacy whether anyone else had seen the lady. No one had, but it was the detail of the gloves that caught Miss Marple's attention. In warm weather, gloves were either affectation or concealment, and when a figure appeared near an old siding no longer in use, one had to wonder whether she had arrived by path, by chance, or by train. It was not difficult for Miss Marple to gain an audience with Mr. Trowan, the train guard on duty the day the 11:45 passed the fort's siding. She had written most courteously, with a query about timmets and rural halts, and the gentleman had responded with eagerness typical of those proud of their railway service. He recalled nothing out of order on the day in question, except perhaps one detail. There had been a carriage door unlatched near the rear of the train, one usually kept secure. He had locked it himself before departure, but on inspection at Paddington, it was ajar again. No damage, no signs of tampering, just a faint impression of movement where none had been expected. He remembered it chiefly because of a scent. A faint trail of perfume, unmistakably feminine, lingered in the corridor. Not the kind sold at the chemist's in Eastbourne, but something richer, older, foreign, perhaps, a trace of something once loved, now misplaced. Miss Marple, while noting this, also asked whether anyone had occupied that section. According to his log, no ticket had been clipped for those seats, which meant either someone had entered and left unrecorded or never intended to be recorded at all. And perfume, Miss Marple reflected silently, was the last thing that vanished. It lingered long after names and intentions had gone. It was during an afternoon tea of unexpected candor that Vivian Fortescue, her composure gently frayed, admitted a fear she had not dared name aloud. Clara, her daughter, had been restless since the day the train passed, tossing in her sleep, murmuring names no one had taught her, and once she had woken screaming about a lady with hands like paper standing by her window. Vivian had tried to dismiss it as childish fancy, but the sensation that Clara was being watched had settled in her bones with uncomfortable certainty. Miss Marple, attentive as ever, asked whether Clara had spoken of colors. Vivian hesitated, then nodded. "Green," she said. "Always green." Vivian had found a scarf folded strangely beneath Clara's cot. Silk, deep green, stained with something she could not identify, and dared not send for cleaning. She had hidden it away beneath linen sheets in a locked drawer, telling no one. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes, bright with memory, recalled Miss Clee's letter, and the woman glimpsed in a moment of violence, wearing green. Fear in such households was rarely permitted. It surfaced not in screams, but in gestures, extra locks, closed curtains, sudden changes of subject. Vivian had grown accustomed to fear, but it was Clara, the child who had seen. The old platform, though now half consumed by thicket and bramble, still bore the faint imprint of use. Moss grew where tickets had once been punched, and the metal rails, now rusted and quiet, retained the memory of motion. Miss Marple walked the edge, seemingly preoccupied with her walking stick and the hazards of uneven ground, but her gaze moved in careful lines, reading the undergrowth as one might read an old letter, pausing at curls, divots, and disturbances in the soil. It was not far from the siding that she found it, partly obscured by nettle leaves and embedded in the roots of an ash sapling. A compact case cracked at the hinge, its once bright enamel dulled by rain and soil. The glass was splintered, the catch no longer held. She did not exclaim. Instead, she folded her gloved hand around it gently, as if recognizing something long lost. The initials engraved on the back were faint, but they were there. She brushed away a strand of ivy, not for effect, but because she had seen something more. A child's toy wool broken in half, buried further in. Two things buried, but not forgotten. Two things waiting to speak. That evening, in her guest room at the vicarage, Miss Marple examined the compact in solitude. The enamel bore a floral motif, faded now, but had once been expensive, the kind of thing a lady kept in her handbag and opened delicately at dances or luncheons. Inside, beneath the cracked mirror, was a small inner recess, clearly tampered with, yet still intact. Within lay a folded photograph, creased at the edges, as though handled many times with both care and secrecy. She unfolded it slowly. It was the image of a child, not an infant, but a girl of perhaps 3 or 4. Golden curls brushed back, the faintest smile on her lips, and the eyes, clear, wide, and a peculiar, unforgettable blue-gray. The same eyes that watched her now from across the parlor at Fortescue Hall. Clara's eyes. The realization did not surprise Miss Marple, though it stirred something quieter, something mournful. Eyes, unlike names, do not lie. If the photograph had belonged to the woman in green then that woman had once carried a likeness of Clara Fortescue, as a mother carries what she cannot speak of aloud. Miss Marple held the compact a moment longer, then returned it to its cloth wrap. The initials M now echoed against another name that had begun to circle her thoughts like a half-forgotten melody. Alice Mlynn, not spoken of, not recorded, but seen once. Buried perhaps, but not erased. She rose from her chair, the compact still in her hand. Somewhere the scent of faded lilac, like old perfume clinging to memory, seemed to stir the room. Miss Marple, whose thoughts traveled backward to travel forward, now knew where the next questions must be asked. And if one mother had carried a likeness in silence, it stood to reason that the silence had cost her everything. There were names one encountered in passing, half-remembered, nearly whispered, and never spoken in the presence of those who preferred forgetfulness to memory. One such name was Alice Mlynn. It had returned to Miss Marple like a faint perfume once worn and never quite forgotten. A discreet conversation with the late gardener's widow confirmed what she already suspected. Alice had once served at Fortescue Hall, not as a parlor or scullery girl, but as a companion, an ambiguous role, often assigned to women too clever for silence and too poor for independence. She had been sharp, observant, and not without charm. But charm in certain households was acceptable only in moderation. Alice had, it seemed, drawn the attention of Edward Fortescue, young then, arrogant with the certainty of family money and little consequence. He had courted her in shadows and silence. Whispers had begun. The servants had noticed, as servants do. And then Alice had begun to change. A subtle swelling of the figure, letters posted in private, books borrowed from the library on legal matters, and finally a visit uninvited to the family solicitor. It was after that visit that Alice had vanished. No farewells, no trunk, no forwarding address. Only a rumor that she had left of her own accord. Miss Marple had heard such phrases before. They were too convenient to be believed. What became clearer upon deeper inquiry was that Alice had not simply left. She had threatened. Threatened not with violence or exposure. Such things held little weight in families like the Forts, but with entitlement. Alice had intended to challenge the estate, not for herself, but for the child she carried. A girl, she had said, had every right to bear the Foresca name, to inherit even in part what blood had granted, but society had denied. The solicitor, whose name surfaced now with unfortunate regularity, had advised her to proceed carefully. There were precedents, though few and hard-fought, and she had possession of letters. It was said, love letters, foolish in content, but damning in implication. After that meeting, Alice returned to Forskew Hall with quiet resolve. She was not dismissed immediately. Rather, there was a week of peculiar stillness. The house, several remembered, had taken on the air of something waiting, and then she was gone. No police report, no notice in the parish register. When one maid inquired, she was told firmly that Alice had taken employment in Yorkshire. Another was informed that Alice had married a man abroad, whose name no one could quite recall. The contradiction spoke volumes. Miss Marple, with hands folded and expression serene, recognized the pattern. When women spoke of claims, of rights, of children born without wedding rings, there were always those who moved swiftly to make them disappear, not with violence, but with plausibility. Records, Miss Marple had long observed, were only as honest as those who kept them, and in houses like Fortescue Hall, there were often two sets, one for history and one for appearances. A quiet inquiry to the local registry office revealed no birth recorded for any child linked to Alice Mlynn, nor any official note of her employment within the estate's formal staff ledgers. Her name had been excised with surgical precision, leaving behind only the faintest impression, like a pressed flower removed from a book, its outlines still haunting the page. The old cook, now retired and residing near Lyme Regis, recalled Alice's handwriting. She had once kept the household accounts in neat columns, each item tallied with care. But when Miss Marple asked to see the ledgers, she was told they had been discarded some years ago during a rationalization of the pantry. What remained was silence, no correspondence, no mention in the family journals. Even the photograph Miss Marple had seen earlier, torn deliberately, was now an orphaned image, without its name. It was not just memory that had been erased. It was personhood. And when a person is erased so thoroughly, Miss Marple knew, it is almost always because someone fears what her return would mean. Miss Marple sat in the morning room of the vicarage, hands lightly resting on her lap, while her mind traced an older pattern beneath the present mystery. What Miss Wilhelmina Clee had seen so fleetingly was not merely a murder in real time. It was a tableau, a reenactment of a death already committed once before. A memory, not a moment. The strangulation of a woman in a moving train compartment, caught in passing by a retired governess with an unerring eye for detail, seemed too theatrical for happenstance. Miss Clee, precise and literal by nature, had described hands about the throat, a green scarf pulled taut, and a face contorted in a single instant of dread. That such a death could occur in silence, without discovery, and vanish without trace, was improbable unless it had been orchestrated by someone with experience. Someone who had done it before and done it well. The private siding, the abandoned coach, the vanished woman, the compact bearing initials, the child whose eyes mirrored the photograph. Each clue, seemingly disconnected, drew itself inward toward a central truth. Alice Mlynn had returned, if only briefly, perhaps to claim her child, perhaps to confront Edward Forescu one final time. She had stepped aboard the train, confident perhaps that she had nothing left to lose. And Edward, cornered by the resurgence of a past he had paid dearly to silence, had acted again, not from impulse, but from repetition. Murder, Miss Marple often reflected, was rarely a first instinct, but for some it became a second nature. If Alice had indeed been murdered a second time, it was not to silence her, but to erase the proof that she had ever returned at all. The death was reported in the local paper, without great fanfare. A solicitor of some years' standing, Mr. Harold Gibbons, had died from a fall down the stairs in his offices near Kellenham. It had been ruled accidental, with no indication of struggle or foul play. But Miss Marple, having once been introduced to Mr. Gibbons through a distant cousin, recalled his precise nervous manner and his tendency to drink more than was entirely advisable when dealing with troublesome clients. She made a few discreet inquiries. Mr. Gibbons had been alone in his chambers the evening of his fall. His assistant had left early, and no appointments were listed. The only curious detail noted by the cleaning woman was a faint scent in the room. Not whiskey or tobacco, but something sweeter, something floral. She also remarked that Mr. Gibbons had been burning documents in the fireplace, a most unusual act, given his habitual fidiousness and fear of misfiling. Miss Marple considered the timing. Gibbons had been the man Alice Mlynn once approached with her claim. He had drafted a codicil, perhaps never filed, and now with the woman's sudden reappearance, he might well have panicked, fearful of exposure, or worse, retribution. But fear alone does not send a man tumbling down polished stairs. Not unless someone helps him. Edward Forescu, already cornered by the past and unraveling under its weight, had likely sought to eliminate what few threads remained. Mr. Gibbons had been one such thread, shaking, frayed, and unfortunately visible. The solicitor was gone now, but as Miss Marple folded the paper and tucked it beside her tea tray, she knew the pattern had become too deliberate to be dismissed. The past was not merely returning. It had begun to strike back. It was a narrow staircase and a cold hallway that led Miss Marple to the junior clerk in Mr. Gibbons' now quiet office. The rooms bore the faint scent of paper and polish mingled with something less distinct, an absence, as though decisions made there had long since fled, but left behind the weight of consequence. Mr. Cartwright, the young man who had served under the late solicitor, received Miss Marple with awkward courtesy. He was pale and earnest, his tie poorly knotted, and his loyalty to the departed practitioner sincere. He did not recognize Miss Marple's name, nor did he question her purpose, only blinked and offered a seat. With a careful hand and gentle persuasion, Miss Marple inquired whether Mr. Gibbons had recently handled documents related to the Fortescue family. At first, Mr. Cartwright demurred, unsure if it was appropriate to discuss such things. But when Miss Marple spoke of Alice Mlynn, her disappearance, her child, the train, something in his expression changed. "Yes," he said quietly. There had been a file, thin, unremarkable. It had contained a handwritten codicil, unsigned but stamped with the Gibbons firm's watermark. It named a beneficiary, a child, illegitimate but acknowledged in private. He had gone looking for that caudal after Mr. Gibbons' death. It was gone. Only the envelope remained, empty and oddly folded, as though it had once held something too important to destroy, yet too dangerous to keep. Miss Marple thanked him gently, for in law, as in life, that which vanishes deliberately often leaves its shape behind, and shapes to the trained eye are as telling as truths. There are some who forget, and others who cannot. Gwen Mallery, once a housemaid at Fortisca Hall, belonged to the latter. She had been young then, too young to understand the full measure of what was happening, but not too young to remember the tone of a voice or the hush that followed a name unspoken. Miss Marple found her now married, settled in a modest house at the edge of the village, and willing to speak in that particular tone, reserved for things best left behind. She remembered Alice, yes, quiet but quick, fond of the child, always well turned out. She'd left suddenly, and no one had been permitted to ask questions. But last week, yes, Gwen was certain. It was her voice she heard again. A woman had come to the market, asking after old friends the location of the hall, whether the railway siding still existed. She had worn a hat pulled low and gone by the name Mrs. Andrews, but the rhythm of her speech, the way she said, "Thank you," with a little downward nod, Gwen would have sworn to it in church. She had disappeared quickly, as if afraid she had already said too much. No purchases, no destination mentioned. Miss Marple did not challenge the memory. She knew the strength of small observations lodged in working minds, and if Alice had indeed returned, she had done so cautiously, knowing that those who vanish are not always welcomed when they reappear. The old gardener, Mr. Abel Jameson, was a man of few words and slower movements, his hands thick with the memory of earth. Miss Marple, seated across from him, with her knitting set discreetly aside, broached the topic of the railway siding, with the same tact she used when discussing whether with the vicer's wife, softly, indirectly, with the patience of one who knows. Silence always comes before confession. He said nothing at first, then his eyes wandered to the window as though searching the hedgerow for a better answer. "I was asked to do it," he said finally. "Not what, not why. Simply it." Years ago, on the edge of dusk, he had been called aside by Graves, the butler, then still sharp in spine and command. A task, confidential, a trunk to be buried. No questions, just speed and discretion. The spot had been marked near the edge of the siding, where wild roses grew thick, and the soil turned easily. He had done as he was told. He never saw what was inside, nor was he asked to check. There was no suggestion of wrongdoing, only an understanding, unspoken, but absolute, that this was to be forgotten. And so he had forgotten, or tried to. Miss Marple listened carefully, not to what he said, but to what he had avoided. For those who bury things rarely forget the weight of what they carry, and she too was beginning to feel that weight. Miss Marple, who had never believed in coincidence, arranged for the quiet excavation without spectacle or ceremony. A retired grave-digger from a neighboring parish, long trusted and short of curiosity, was summoned under the pretext of restoring a family marker left to ruin. The corner of the property where the platform once stood had become unruly with years of growth. Ivy, brambles, and the slow encroachment of moss had disguised all but the subtle rise in earth that betrayed deliberate disturbance. Spades met soil with the hush of secrecy. Inch by inch the ground gave way, first to stone, then to splintered timber, and finally to emptiness. There was no trunk, no bones, no remnants of cloth or velvet, or the metallic trace of a lock long rusted, only disturbed earth, compacted, settled, and empty. Miss Marple said nothing aloud, but within her a certainty shifted. If something had once lain there, it had been moved, not by time, but by hands that remembered its location well enough to return and remove it. And if one was willing to unbury what had once been hidden, it meant the past had grown urgent, perhaps dangerous. Miss Marple bent briefly to brush her hand across a patch of exposed soil. There were no answers there now, but the absence, sharp and deliberate, had begun to speak. The coach, when found, stood idle in a siding far from its original line, shunted to the back of a depot used only for storage and disuse. Miss Marple, whose inquiries had led her to a retired station master with a fondness for recollection, secured a private viewing by invoking with tact her late cousin's connection to the Great Western Railway. The carriage was intact, clean, too clean. The surfaces had been scrubbed, the upholstery replaced or removed. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no trace of those natural signs which mark the passage of time, only an over-earnest sense of order, as if someone had labored not to preserve, but to erase. But what cannot be wholly cleaned often leaves a whisper. Miss Marple, moving slowly, noted a faint shadow upon the seat, something too subtle for a cloth to erase. A discoloration in the velvet round, faded, but unmistakably blood once shed. And on the floor beneath the bench, a single silk button, dark green, glossed, the kind once sewn upon a woman's traveling coat, slightly frayed, with the thread still clinging to its base. It was the kind of thing that might have come loose in a struggle, or fallen, as one's coat was hastily removed. Miss Marple picked it up without triumph. It was not victory, she felt, but the somber quiet that followed confirmation. The coach had been used, not just once, but again, carefully, precisely, to recreate a death, so that it might be witnessed, but not believed. Miss Wilhelmina had seen the second death, a warning, a reenactment, or the final act itself. And now, with the discovery of a coach too immaculate, and a button too damning, Miss Marple felt the final layers drawing back. Not long now, she thought, before the name behind it all must speak, if not by mouth, then by the echo of what had been so desperately concealed. There was something ceremonial about the afternoon. Not a celebration, certainly, nor a simple social occasion. It was tea as reckoning, served not with laughter and lightness, but with porcelain, steadied by hands that knew too well what trembled beneath silence. Miss Marple, though never one to intrude where she was not invited, had extended her own invitation this time. It was framed, of course, as a courtesy, a final visit before returning to St. Mary, a small expression of gratitude for hospitality received. Yet those summoned to Foresca Hall, Lady Fortescue, Edward, Vivian, and Graves understood consciously or not that this gathering was not one to be declined. The parlor had been prepared, flowers arranged, the silver polished, portraits of long-dead Furuscues looked down with the impassive dignity of generations that believed discretion could conceal anything if upheld long enough. Miss Marple sat with a slight incline of the head, her fingers lightly resting on her teaspoon. She made no pronouncements. She asked no direct questions, but her eyes, that soft gray of English fog, moved slowly across each face, measuring, weighing, listening to what was not spoken, and somewhere beneath the clink of cup against saucer, the first fault lines of truth began to shift. Miss Marple began, as always, without preamble and without performance. Her voice, calm and unhurried, held no accusation, only an unwavering certainty drawn from patient observation, and a mind as finely woven as her needlepoint. She spoke of a woman, Alice Mlynn, who had once lived under this very roof, not in opulence, but in quiet service. She had been trusted, then dismissed, and then forgotten. Except she had not disappeared of her own accord. She had returned under an assumed name, cloaked in caution, and compelled by something stronger than revenge. She had come, Miss Marple believed, not to disrupt, but to reclaim her name, her dignity, her child. On the day she boarded the 11:45 train, she carried not a weapon, nor the bitterness of years undone. She carried a compact, a folded photograph, and a slim sheath of papers, legal, damaging, irrefutable. She had arranged to meet Edward, not at the hall, where eyes would see, but on the train, where compartments could be private, and brief moments uninterrupted. And she wore green, a rich, unmistakable green. She had believed, Miss Marple continued softly, that he might listen, that some trace of past feeling might soften him. But Edward, when confronted not with affection but with consequences, had never been the sort of man to yield. The siding, long disused, bore a significance that no timetable could measure. It was not simply a place of convenience. It was a space outside accountability. Miss Marple explained this without flourish. The siding had once served the family with pride. Later it had served them with secrecy. Edward, upon receiving Alice's message, had orchestrated the meeting with precision. The coach, still shunted in the depot, immaculate in its concealment, had been unlocked for her arrival, its curtains drawn, its seat cushions arranged, everything suggesting comfort. But Alice, Miss Marple said gently, had not stepped into comfort. She had stepped into finality. Edward had killed her there, not in anger, but in calculation. There had been a moment of struggle, a green scarf perhaps, gloves, removed or not. She had died silently as the train passed a patch of track where no one looked. Her body had not remained in the coach. It had been removed swiftly, efficiently. Miss Marple paused, then continued more quietly. It had been placed in the Fortescue family crypt, a place often under repair, a place where stonemasons came and went, where restoration works required no questions. The remains were listed as ancestral. No inspection would ever be made. The codicil missing. The compact buried then lost. The solicitor pressured and Alice herself erased once more. Miss Marple looked to Edward, who had not moved. Only Vivian's breath caught faintly. Her hand trembled near her teacup, and in that moment, it was not accusation that lingered, but the unbearable gravity of a truth finally named. Miss Marple's voice, though unchanged in cadence, grew ever more deliberate. She spoke now of Mr. Gibbons, the solicitor, a man not known for courage, but for caution. He had once drafted a caudal at Alice's behest, a document incomplete perhaps, but damning nonetheless. It had not been filed, but it had existed, and when Alice returned, so did the weight of his earlier compliance. Edward had visited him, MissMarple believed, perhaps not with threat, but with urgency. He had requested the document. Gibbons had refused or hesitated, and so the solicitor had fallen, not merely from a stairwell, but from safety. He had been alone, no witnesses, no marks, but a smell of perfume, burned papers, a room too clean, and fear. A solicitor's deep, quiet, all-consuming fear. MissMarple's gaze rested gently on Lady Fortescue. "There are deaths that arrive by intention," she said softly, "and those which follow in its shadow." The older woman closed her eyes. Whether in resignation or relief, no one could say. Edward for the first time moved to speak, but MissMarple, rising slowly, placed two objects upon the tray. A torn photograph and a silk button. "The past," she said, "does not vanish by will. It lingers, it watches, and one day it returns, always on time. There are revelations that arrive not with thunder, but with silence." It was in this silence that MissMarple, having gently restored order to the tea tray, spoke once more, this time not of death, but of life, and of the life that had remained. Clara, a child of sweetness and striking eyes whose presence in the household had always been accepted, though never quite explained. A child officially adopted, according to parish records, by Edward and Vivian Fortescue, during a period conveniently unexamined. MissMarple observed Vivian closely, not with accusation, but with the quiet compassion of one who understands what it costs a woman to carry what is not hers, yet must be claimed as such. Vivian did not speak. Her hands folded in her lap, tightened just once. MissMarple continued. Alice had left more than a caudle. She had left a child, and that child, if not protected, could be used by inheritance, by law, or by fear. Vivian had accepted the child, not as an act of love toward Edward, but as an act of rescue, a silent recognition of another woman's defeat. And for years she had endured the daily presence of her husband's guilt, seated at her breakfast table and asking for jam. MissMarple concluded with no triumph, only stillness, and the hush that follows the naming of what had always been known, but never admitted. It was Graves, that most loyal of butlers, who stepped forward as MissMarple produced the final evidence. With a small nod, he placed a leather-bound folio gently upon the sideboard. It had been stored behind the old accounts, untouched for years, sealed in wax, but not destroyed. Inside lay the codicil, not the original, but a copy retained perhaps out of habit or conscience, dated, witnessed, and naming a child. Clara Lynn Fortescue as recipient of a modest but undeniable portions of the family trust. Beside it, MissMarple placed a photograph, torn but unmistakable. Edward stared. Then slowly, with a sort of weary disbelief, he took the folio in his hand. No one spoke. Then, with a sudden shudder, as though the weight of years had pressed at once upon his chest, he sank into the nearest chair. He did not deny it. Not the affair, not the child, not the death. "I thought I could manage it," he said at last to no one in particular. Thought it could be put away. He had believed Alice's silence could be bought or frightened. When that failed, he had reverted to the only method he had ever known to remove consequences. He had buried her once in the earth and again in the crypt and tried finally to bury her in memory. But the child had remained, and memory, MissMarple reflected, had a peculiar habit of surfacing, like a button from a torn coat overlooked beneath a railway bench. And so the silence of Fortescue Hall was broken, not by shouting, but by truth. And in truth came the first breath of something, not quite peace, but the possibility of it. The arrest was conducted without spectacle, no shouting, no cuffs, merely the gentle clearing of a constable's throat and a murmured formality, to which Edward Fortescue responded with a nod and a hollow expression that suggested something had already died within him. There was no plea, no defense, only silence, long unbroken. Lady Fortescue stood motionless as it happened. She did not protest, nor did she meet her son's eye. In the final reckoning, the family matriarch, so long the guardian of appearance and tradition, retreated not behind words, but behind a veil of detachment. When later asked by the vicar if she wished to make a statement, she simply remarked that her family's affairs were no longer of public interest. She did not leave her chambers again. Vivian, for her part, did not remain. Within days of Edward's removal, She departed quietly, accompanied by her daughter and a nursemaid. There were no farewells, only a small note left with the housekeeper, kind in tone, brief in content. The words spoke not of bitterness, but of necessity. A life must be made elsewhere. A child must grow without shadow. Miss Marple watched it unfold from a distance. She had no triumph in her expression, only the thoughtful stillness of one who had seen such endings before. Not grand, not tragic, but inevitable. And in the drawing rooms of St. Mary, Maine, as conversation drifted toward daffodils and deviled eggs, the name Fortescue was spoken a little less often and always with a touch of softness, as though recalling a house once proud, now quiet. It was a letter from the parish ston that confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. During scheduled restoration work on the Fortescue family vault undertaken under diocesan instruction, an additional interment was discovered, unmarked, unregistered, and unrecognized. The body, long since reduced to bones and faded fabric, had been concealed beneath the floor slab bearing the name of Lord Jasper Fortescue, whose burial dated some years prior. The positioning had been deliberate, the stone lifted cleanly, the cavity shaped for concealment. Among the remnants were fragments of green silk, one gold earring, and the broken chain of a compact case. Identification came not from records. None existed, but from the photograph Miss Marple had retained and the undeniable link it carried to Clara Fortescue. Alice Morland had been buried not with dignity but with erasure. Yet now, in the light of law and acknowledgment, her name was restored, the death certificate amended. The church bell tolled quietly one morning for a woman few remembered and fewer had honored. Miss Marple did not attend the brief service. She remained instead in her parlor, allowing others to say the words she had already said privately and long ago when she understood the truth, not in fact, but in human pattern. For crimes of concealment are not ended by punishment, but by remembrance. It was at the monthly meeting of the Ladies' Guild that Miss Wilhelmina Clee received the only recognition she would ever request. A modest statement by the vicar, a brief silence, and then a round of polite, sincere applause. More felt than heard. Miss Clee nodded as though confirming something she had long suspected, but never voiced aloud. No fuss was made. No newspaper carried the tale beyond a few lines in the local press. Yet within the village it became quietly known that Miss Clee had seen, not imagined, that her unwavering insistence, so often dismissed as a symptom of solitary living, had been in the end the first light on a path none had wished to tread. She had spotted death in a passing window and held on to its truth even as it slipped through every official grasp. Miss Marple, who had written to her with gentle praise, received in reply a thank-you card bearing only one line handwritten in careful script. I shall never again doubt my eyes. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, is not always served in courts. Sometimes it arrives at a tea table, or in a church pew, or in the tremble of a chin no longer questioned. And that too is justice. Back in her cottage in St. Mary, Miss Marple resumed the rhythm of her days. Tea at 3, letters answered before luncheon, and a modest garden pruned into order by her own slow hands. The headlines had shifted to politics and weather. The village turned its attention to the church roof, and the Women's Institute garden fed. Life, like ivy, grew again over what had been uncovered. But within Miss Marple's parlor, a different kind of reckoning persisted. As she worked on a fresh pattern, pale blue wool for a newborn cousin, her thoughts drifted not to justice delivered, but to the strange quiet with which it often arrived. There had been no confrontation, no dramatic exposure, only the truth laid gently before those who could no longer deny it. She thought of Vivian and the courage of women who chose protection over protest, of Lady Fortescue, who had sealed her legacy with silence, of Graves, who had carried obedience as far as his conscience allowed, and of Alice Mullen, who had died asking only to be seen. The world did not always remember such women, but Miss Marple did. In the steady loop of her thread, in the pause between stitches, she remembered. For there is strength in remembering, and there is grace in naming. And in the corners of the village no one visits. Justice sometimes sits with her tea, perfectly content and entirely unseen. At the edge of Miss Marple's writing desk, tucked beside the blotting paper and her silver pen knife, sat a clipping from the Daily Gazette. It bore no headline of drama, just a note, citing at Fortescue Hall to be permanently decommissioned, tracks to be lifted before winter. She read it once, then folded it and placed it under the base of her inkstand. Trains, she mused, arrive by timetable, but justice by its own rhythm. The 11:45 from Paddington Green had passed without stopping. No whistle, no brakes. Yet it had carried within it a cry. The last of a woman long thought vanished, now known. And when it passed that siding again one final time, it did so not in silence, but in recognition. Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea, adjusting the doily beneath the pot. The past, she said softly, never does travel far. It usually catches the 11:45, and outside the garden bloomed again, not in forgetfulness, but in quiet remembrance. And so a train that never stopped still managed to deliver justice. Not loudly, not swiftly, but in the quiet, persistent way that truth travels. Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom and unerring sense of human nature, reminded us again that evil rarely hides behind masks of wickedness, but more often behind good manners, silences, and well-kept hedges. In the end, it wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic twist that solved the mystery. It was a child's eyes, a forgotten photograph, and a button that refused to stay buried. The past tried to vanish, but as Miss Marple so rightly said, it always catches the 11:45. And now, a question just for you. If you had found the photograph tucked inside that compact, would you have known what it meant? Or would you have passed it by, thinking it only a relic of someone else's life?